the status on Russia, and then we're going to open the floor to some questions and answers because Rune has to catch a flight, so he has to leave here about 2 o'clock. And then Roberto and Belen will talk a bit about the centenary. So, if you want to listen in English, it is channel 5. If you'd like to listen in Spanish, it's channel 4.
6.
Okay, let's go.
Sí, hablan francés, lo lamento. Vamos. Jackie.
Again, thank you for taking time to be with us. I'm sorry we've kept you waiting a little bit. Council meetings are never an exact science, but I'm really grateful for your patience, and welcome to all of you following this on our live stream. We're 3/4 of the way through our 2-day council meeting here in Buenos Aires. I have with me on stage Rune Andersson, the chair of our Russian task force, who made his recommendations to the council this morning. I'm delighted to be joined by Roberto Gesto de Melo, the president of Considerate, a long servant to athletics at every level in the sport and a good friend. And particularly pleased that Belen is with us today, who was a steeplechase finalist at the great World Championships in London, and she will talk a little bit, as will Roberto, about the centenary celebrations that we are going to enjoy this evening. But let me first of all recap on yesterday's announcements. We announced a new sponsor yesterday, Qatar National Bank. This is a 4-year, multi-million-dollar sponsorship starting in 2019. We also awarded Nairobi in Kenya our Under-20 World Championships in 2020, following their successful hosting of the Under-18 Championships, which some of my council colleagues in the room today, I'm delighted to be joined by, were actually with me at, and extraordinary crowds, which drew up to 60,000 in the stadium. The other decisions of note, under our new bidding rules designed to eliminate the costly beauty parade of cities wanting to host our main championships when they may not be ready or may be better suited to host other IAAF championships, the Council will take into the discussion with European cities and approve the recommendation that Budapest is the preferred European city to host the IAAF World Championships in 2023. But let me be clear here. The process is now a full technical, financial and risk evaluation to be undertaken, and that analysis to be presented to the Council in December, and at that stage a final decision will be made by the Council. We have also agreed to reinstate our transfer of allegiance of athletes under new rules and to take immediate effect. To remind everyone, we froze the transfer of allegiance in February last year so that we could properly look at rules governing them. And again, let me remind you why we did this. We did this because it was very clear to the Council and to all our stakeholders in the sport that this was becoming a growing problem, particularly in athlete trafficking. We set out, and again it's important to remember what we set out to achieve here. We set out to provide, crucially, a safe environment for the athletes, to protect the athletes' rights to freedom of movement and livelihood, to protect member federations against depletion of young talent, and crucially the diversion of funding from governments and associated organisations, to in essence contribute to athletes' development. Thirdly, to ensure the integrity of our sport, and crucially, of course, the credibility of our sport. The new rules, which will be sent out to member federations next week and posted on our website, enshrine the following key principles that were adopted in our council meeting in March in Birmingham, just after the Indoor World Championships. Firstly, the establishment of a review panel to make determinations on the credibility of applications. clear evidence that countries are offering full and permanent citizenship and associated rights, a minimum 3-year waiting period before an athlete may transfer to represent another member federation, and the provision that an athlete can transfer only once, and that no transfers can take place under the age of 20. We have a clear duty of care to young athletes. As you know, we have a number of area championships coming up in the next couple of weeks. So the Transfer of Allegiance Review Panel will endeavour to process those that have been held in the system as quickly as possible. But it is also important for me to note that no athlete should assume that they will be cleared under these rules automatically. We take this seriously, and all athletes will be required to complete new paperwork and sign a declaration, which will then go to the panel for review and approval or otherwise. The IAAF Council also approved new regulations around our anti-doping rules, which set out new obligations for its member federations in the fight against doping. Previously, the obligations under the anti-doping code were focused primarily on individuals rather than on member federations. Under Article 15, the IAAF will divide member federations into 3 different categories, which will have different obligations based on their level of success in athletics and, of course, the risk and prevalence of doping. The current watch list of 4 member federations, Kenya, Ethiopia, Belarus, and Ukraine, will be folded into Category A, which will include those member federations most at risk of doping. The national team athletes from these federations must undergo at least 3 out-of-competition doping tests in the 10 months before a World Championships or an Olympic Games. Category B will include the other federations who are competitive at international level. Category C will include federations with very few international level athletes. And Category A and B federations will be required to ensure that athlete testing plans are submitted to the IAAF before each World Championship or Olympic Games. Under this system, the Athletics Integrity Unit will have responsibility for monitoring and reporting breaches, but the IAAF Council will determine any sanctions. This creates a much better system where member federations take a level of accountability in ensuring their athletes undergo the required tests and have the information and education, of course, to make the right and timely choices. We've also had updates from a number of our commissions, and this afternoon we will progress reports on our upcoming events, the Continental Cup in Ostrava in September, Summer Youth Olympic Games here in Buenos Aires in October. Crucially, the presentation from the organising committee of our next World Championships in Doha 2019, and governance and integrity reforms around bidding and elections. Before handing over to Rune to take you through the Russian Task Force recommendations, I'd like to add that we have had updates and discussions on elements that will help streamline our sport for both athletes and fans. We're progressing the world ranking list, which we aim to have in place at the beginning of next year, and we're also progressing with our restructuring of the global calendar. We are moving forward with our plans to revamp the Diamond League. The Council has been clear that change is vital, and we will be introducing a robust evaluation system, a strong digital focus so athletes and fans can better follow the rhythm of the season and the athletes themselves. We're looking at elements that have been successful in the past, for example, showcasing some of our field events. Those of you who were at the Monaco Diamond League the other day would know exactly what we are referring to. On our world ranking and global calendar, and crucially, that the World Championships will end our season. We also talked about the kit that athletes wear at Diamond League and the confusion this causes when sometimes 60% of the field or more are all lining up in exactly the same kit. And I know you probably feel this is sort of a Groundhog Day conversation, and I know that many of my colleagues will feel this. We're now setting up a group to look at this. There has to be change here. This really does not help the sport, either clearly or cosmetically. And lastly, as I travel around the globe talking to athletes, member federations, fans, agents and the media, there is an overwhelming need to address the process by which athlete representatives are accredited. I don't want to go into huge or detailed discussion here, but it is very clear and has been clear to me for a time that we need a centralized system, one that takes some of those sanctioning decisions away from member federations. We hold athlete representatives, and the good ones want this change. I met with some of them at the Diamond League meeting on Sunday last week in London. They themselves want this and also accept that they need to be governed by exactly the same rigor of governance that we hold ourselves and the athletes to. We need far better eligibility processes and clearer ethical and integrity guidelines. I've asked that the current regulations be reviewed with a new regulation presented to Council at a meeting in December, following the relevant consultation. This will mean they can be in place from the beginning of the 2019 season. Let me now immediately hand over to Rune. Thank you.
Thank you, President. At the last council meeting in Birmingham in March this year, the task force expressed frustration at the lack of progress being made by the Russians in meeting the remaining reinstatement conditions. We warned that if that continued, then the task force may be forced to recommend at this meeting that the task force be disbanded and steps be taken towards the full expulsion of RUSAF from IAAF membership. I'm pleased to say that that message had its desired effect. There has been a lot of meaningful engagement from RUSAF since the last meeting, and they have made significant progress in meeting the outstanding requirements. In fact, in some cases, they have gone above and beyond what is required. We commend RUSAV President Dmitry Slyatkin for leading this progressive approach. At this point, there are three main requirements outstanding. Payment of the costs incurred by IAAF as a result of the Russian crisis, including the cost of the task force and the cost of the various CAS cases. RUSAF has made a written commitment to pay all of those costs once they are finalized. Reinstatement of RUSADA by WADA, which depends on the Russian authorities acknowledging the findings of the McLaren and Schmidt commissions that officials from the Russian Ministry of Sport orchestrated the doping conspiracy and cover-up described in their reports, and the Russian authorities providing access to the data from testing of samples at the Moscow lab from 2011 to 2015, so that the IAAF and other sports concerned can determine whether the suspicious findings reported in the Moscow lab's LIMS database should or should not be pursued as adverse analytical findings. The task force agreed that with WADA that these are very important requirements. If the Russian authorities do not acknowledge that Ministry of Sport officials corrupted the operations of RUSADA and the Moscow lab, how can we have any comfort there won't be any repeats in the future? And how can Russian athletes be readmitted to international competitions without undermining the integrity of those competitions unless all of the suspicious findings reported in the LIMS data have first been resolved? It would make a mockery of clean sport to reinstate RUSAF when the evidence required to resolve these suspicions, one way or the other, is still being withheld. We know that WADA is communicating with the Russian authorities to try to resolve these points before the meeting of the WADA Executive Committee meeting in September 2018. We hope that there will be a breakthrough. If so, and as a result, these points are resolved before the Council Council next meeting in Monaco in December 2018, then the task force would hope and expect to be able to recommend that RUSAF be provisionally reinstated at that time. If not, if those points remain unresolved, then the task force will not be able to make that recommendation, but instead will have to consider other options. And as you will take from what I've just have said, the Council unanimously adopted a resolution that RUSAF not be reinstated for the time being.
Thank you, Rune. Now, we only have for 4 or 5 minutes, so if we can quickly go to some Q&As. If anyone's got any questions specifically about the Russian Task Force report, could they put their hands up and do those first? And then Seb and Roberto and Bellum will be here for a little while longer. Any questions on the Russian report? Yes, gentleman at the front. There's a microphone. Could you just let us know where you're from?
Yeah, I'm Pablo Ramon from FNU Services. I'm from Spain. My question is, what are the points in which Russia has actually improved?
Okay, we will put up, I mean, I'll let Rune answer this, but we will put up the full report on our website in about 2 hours, once the meeting's finished. It does go through each of those reinstatement points and where progress has or has not been made. Yeah. Sorry, Rune.
Well, it will be in the report, but briefly, there has been an issue with provisional suspension of coaches and coaches coaching athletes. That's been a big issue for a long time. That has now been resolved, and we are happy with the result, which is based on Russian legislation and the way that the Russians are dealing with this. We are confident that this is being resolved. The culture of doping in Russia is something that the Russians have been working very, very hard to come about. And we're happy to report that what they've done specifically towards young athletes is something that we cherish and that we hope that they will continue to do. So that's just a couple of issues.
Thanks, Rune. Any other questions on the Russian Task Force report? No? Okay, I might just say thank you to Rune, because I know you've got a plane to catch. Okay, thanks, Rune. And then I think what I'll do before we go into full Q&A is hand over to Roberto. You can all move up one if you like. You stay where you are. Perfect. Okay. Just to talk about the centenary. So, Roberto, over to you.
Dear President Sebastian Coe, colleagues from the Council present here today, ladies and gentlemen, the press from Argentina and South America, it's a huge pleasure to be here in Buenos Aires celebrating the centennial of the South American Confederation of Athletics, the oldest entity in this geographical area and in the world. Founded here on the 24th of May, 100 years ago, that has been the venue of La Razón newspaper, or at the venue of La Razón newspaper. Here, under the leadership of President Coe, the IAAF Council has had the opportunity of making important decisions. As you have been informed through the press releases. Likewise, President Coe, at the beginning of this year, launched a project for the memorabilia of world athletics through pieces of interest that will be placed in a future museum to be set up in Monte Carlo. And on the other hand, they are being shown in different parts of the world to promote investigation and studies with the purpose of disseminating the ideals of the Olympics and of athletics. The South American Athletics Confederation has had the privilege of being the first body in having historical objects, 100 historical objects at the beginning of the year, having this show the sports in the world through artifacts from the olden Greek times, bringing to us memories of the pre-Hellenic games through to the end of the 19th century. Here in Buenos Aires, the Confederation will make a second donation of objects to show the importance of athletics, the great sports events during the first half of the 20th century, since athletics was responsible for significant times in mankind's history. I'd like to make a brief mention about Athens. There you will find a medal, a paper medal, that was handed over or delivered in 1984, when the war prisoners got together to preserve the Olympic memories and recalled the Olympic Games. It's a very difficult piece to find, and that brings back memories of very painful times of mankind's history. The ideal of the Olympic Games, of athletics, regarding that terrible life that these people were leading, showing the true values of sports. So it's a pleasure to have here our dear athlete, who's an example here in South America. She's representing all of the athletes of our continent at this tribute that we are going to pay to the Confederation. And this evening, we will recall the very important moments of history in South America.
I will continue in Rio de Janeiro with 2 gold medals and 1 silver medal in Rio de Janeiro, and now the last World Championships for the under-20. We had 6 medals in South America. This is a new path, a path that we have followed to overcome some difficulties of the region, big distances, the economic problems, because that's where our federations are inserted. But this is done with effort, with education, and the Consudato, the Confederation, is working to overcome these hurdles. Thank you very much to the Argentine people, to the authorities, to the Argentine Confederation of Athletics, and my friends from the IAAF and our president, and good luck to all of you.
Oh, thank you. So, Belen, perhaps you'd like to tell a bit about what the centenary means to you.
Good afternoon. I'm very thankful for the IAAF Council to be here in Argentina. I know they're making very important decisions too, and in turn, we are celebrating the centennial of the foundation of Consudatle. Argentina is one of the pioneer members in this confederation. With the results in the World Cup steeplechase in London being 11th and being the first Argentine athlete to be a finalist, I think this will be helpful to help us grow in this sport as a South American country. So we always hope for the best at the South American level and at the world level too. Thank you very much.
And right, any questions for any of those three? Hands up. Wow. Oh, one.
Bueno, bien.
I wish to welcome Sebastian Coe to Argentina and Gustavo Montes, Director of Factor Running. Apart from being a communication platform, we produce the Global Running Day on the 6th of June, and we produce the Urban Mile in Buenos Aires City that is organized at the Obelisk once a year, and Belén has been the winner there. For Sebastian Coe, have you and your team thought of reinforcing actions and taking athletics out into the streets to show that to the people so growth is even greater in the sports?
Yes, absolutely. There's hardly a council meeting or a gathering of my council colleagues or any stakeholder in the sport that doesn't recognize that we need to take the sport in many cases to where people are. We can't always assume that people are going to come to our stadiums just because we have an athletics event on. We need to be creative about how we do that. And I made mention just a few minutes ago of some of the way that we are showcasing, for instance, field events in our Diamond League program, world shot put competitions in the Grand Place in Brussels, and pole vaulting competitions alongside our Diamond League events. It was Central Station in Zurich, and just the other day, a similarly fabulous competition in Monaco. But yes, street. The urban landscape is crucial to us, and I think we recognize that we need to do more in that area.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Regarding the, regarding the next World Championship in Doha, how in this meeting you presented the committee, no? Right?
Actually, I said we're sort of 3/4 of the way through our council meeting. This afternoon we have presentations and progress reports.
Okay.
So Doha will be presenting to our council this afternoon.
Okay, so it's this afternoon. Okay. No, the question is about Russia again. I wanted to know your views about the matter and about the advances made by the Russian Federation.
I don't think there's very much more I can or frankly should add to the independent chair, Rune Andersson, and my colleagues on the council that form part of that task force. I think Rune's recommendation to us, which was unanimously accepted, was balanced. I think it recognized that progress has been made in some key areas, that there are still some gaps to be filled, but I think my council colleagues concluded that we have brought about change, and it's change that is verifiable, and it's change that has been sought alongside the new Russian Federation. The criteria, if I remind you, was not unilaterally thrown on the table. It was agreed with the Russian Federation at the time. So we are making progress, but the recommendation was that we weren't yet at that point where we could be entirely comfortable that every element of that criteria had been met.
Okay, yes, gentleman over there.
Sí, buenos días.
Good morning, Marcelo Gatman from Analytical Sports and La Nación newspaper for Sebastian Coe. We are living in times where, for the new generations, it's very difficult to focus attention on a single thing. I would like to know what's the IAAF's view on how to attract the attention of the new generations based on athletics values.
There are people in my age group that find difficulty in focusing on one thing at a time. But it's a very valid question, and I think that, let me make a broader observation. Yes, we are a competitive sport, and we are in a competitive sporting environment, but actually I have concluded some years ago that sport is not our only competitive element. You know, there are things that distract and engage young people in a good and a positive way. I'm not talking just simply about sitting, you know, watching reality television all day, but there is an engagement across a whole range of social issues and interactions that simply were not there, or our ability to access that was not there 20, 30, 40 years ago. We need to make sure for young people that our sport remains relevant. And that's not just on the field of play, it's also about what we look like as a federation. Do we reflect the world that they live in? Do we have representation from around the world? Are we a diverse organization open to different opinions and different cultures? Are we gender balanced? And in large part, we have still a lot of work to do in that area. And do we take a position on the big issues of the day, on globalization, on social mobility, on immigration maybe, or even on some of the big issues around sustainability? And I think that in the last couple of years, our sport has realized that we need to engage at many different levels to attract the attention of young people. Yes, there are things that we can do in our sport to make our sport more understandable, and not just to young people. There are regulations and rules that I suspect are a retardant to that understanding. I think there are things that we can do in terms of the rhythm and the pace of athletics events without losing the basic philosophy that has guided us for 33 centuries. All these things we need to do, but my instinct is that the greatest amount of work is not simply on the field of play, it is beyond the field of play in allowing young people to recognize there is a place for us, for them in our sport at every level, not just as competitors, but as volunteers, as coaches, as educators, as parents. And I think that is why the work that we're doing in the council at the moment, particularly around integrity and around trust and being broader to a spectrum of views is a really important process that we've undertaken.
I mean, Belen, what do you promote the sport to young people?
Well, what you should do, or well, what you're doing, I'd say, is already very good. You're promoting sports. If we compare it to previous years, what's happening now is not the same as in the past. Many of the youngsters are being incentivized to take interest in different disciplines, and there are many of us that we are bringing into athletics because as time goes by, there are more children that want to train, represent their countries, experiment, try out different disciplines. So it's good for that to continue growing and that we incentivize the younger generation.
Thanks. Thanks, Belen. Any other questions? Yes, gentleman at the front. Looks like it's snowing outside and inside.
Sí, la verdad que sí. Muy buena.
Yes, indeed. Good afternoon. Julio Martinez from Montevideo, Uruguay, ADN Running. I have a question, in fact, two, for Sebastian Coe. One of the greatest black holes in society is drug. In sports overall, doping has not disappeared. There are times in which the situation is worse than in others. In athletics, how are you faring in fighting against doping? At some point, do you think we can have an athletics without doping, or is there no way back on that? Our steps. And then Paris, the next president of the Olympic Committee, will that be Sebastian Coe?
Let me deal with your first point, and probably only your first point. You make a very important point. Let me just say something that is probably slightly counter-narrative. We are in a very much securer environment in sport than we've ever been around our approach to anti-doping. If you'd been sitting here with me 40 years ago, you probably wouldn't have asked that question, and I wouldn't have probably answered it. And I was competing in a significantly less secure environment. Our testing is better than it's ever been. There is a greater realization, not just amongst athletes, but amongst the crucial stakeholder groups in sport, that free and fair and open competition can only be based on exactly that, and that sport wouldn't have survived 3 weeks, let alone 33 centuries, had it not been based on that clear understanding. We are doing a great deal. And actually, and we shouldn't be coy about saying what I'm about to say. The IAAF has led the way on this, and it's led the way for many, many years. We were the first federation to have out-of-competition testing. We were the first federation to put pressure on the Olympic movement to make sure that our testing procedures were at major championships absolutely appropriate. Yes, we've had challenges, but I think that the position that we have adopted at this very moment, particularly on a non-negotiable position on this, are programs of education, of working with young people to make them understand that it is quite possible for young athletes to leave the playground at the age of 11 and feature in world championships maybe 10 years later, and to do it with integrity. And it's not just with athletes, it's about agents, it's about managers, it's about the ecosystem that is sometimes around those athletes. And that's why the Athletics Integrity Unit is not just focusing simply on detection or sanction. It's not just focusing on weeding out the cheats. It's also trying to create systems and structures that protect the clean athletes. So will we ever get to a position where we live in a utopian world where, no, I have to be honest, it probably isn't going to happen. But what I do think is that we're winning the battle of hearts and minds, and we're certainly winning the battle in the ability to apply clear technology. And, if there was a gap between what the illegitimate side of science was doing and what the legitimate side of science was trying to catch up on, that gap is significantly closer, has been significantly closed. And the athlete biological passport, our ability to intelligently identify and test, is something that I think will hold us in very good stead. And the other issue is completely beyond my gift.
Now, we unfortunately have to go back to council, so I'm going to certainly steal Seb away. But you guys get 2 for the price of 1 today, just a special day. There's going to be another press briefing immediately after this one, where we have Diego Zaba from World Mountain Running Championships, Paolo Augusto Brunei from this, I think he's Secretary of Tourism of Villa Angostura, and also Daniel Soto, president of the Argentinian Athletics Federation. So they're going to come onto the stage. We're going to leave. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much indeed.